December 22nd, 1944. Imagine being trapped, freezing, surrounded by an enemy that outnumbers you 10 to 1. This is Bastogne, and the Americans inside aren't surrendering, they're about to do the impossible. Stick around, because you're about to see how 101st Airborne turned despair into chaos for Hitler's finest.
December 22nd, 1944. The Ardennes forest was buried under a suffocating blanket of snow, freezing cold that cut to the bone. The town of Bastogne was surrounded, completely encircled by the German army, tanks rumbling in the distance, infantry massed in terrifying numbers. Inside, the men of the American 101st Airborne Division were running out of food, rations depleted, winter clothing torn and tattered, and bullets running low. Outside the town, the German commander, General von Luttwitz, sent a formal typed ultimatum: surrender or face total annihilation. General Anthony McAuliffe read it, crumpled the paper, and gave one-word reply: nuts. For the Germans, it wasn't just an insult, it was infuriating. It broke their expectations of warfare. By every military standard, the Americans should have been defeated. But the 101st didn't play by conventional rules. These men were paratroopers, trained to fight surrounded, with no tanks, no safe rear, no fallback positions. Being encircled wasn't disaster. It was normal operating procedure. Their doctrine relied on extreme, localized aggression. From the first jump on D-Day, the Germans learned how deadly these airborne soldiers could be. On June 6, 1944, paratroopers scattered across Normandy, missed drops all over the countryside. Pilots blinded by flak and clouds dropped men miles from objectives. Units were broken. Alone in darkness, the soldiers adapted. Chaos became their ally. The Germans couldn't locate the main American forces. Every patrol ran into small, heavily armed groups of paratroopers, cutting communications, ambushing convoys, destroying artillery. To the Germans, it felt like an overwhelming force, 10 times its size. Later, in Carentan, German elite troops, the Fallschirmjäger, tried to crush the Americans in brutal street fighting. The 101st refused to stop attacking. Despite casualties, despite chaos, they moved forward with bayonets, grenades, and sheer willpower. They captured the town, proving to the Germans that these Americans weren't soft conscripts. They were apex predators, relentless, unpredictable, and lethal. The Germans' hatred for the screaming eagles grew with every operation. Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands only intensified it. The 101st was dropped to capture a series of bridges along Hell's Highway. German panzer divisions rolled up expecting easy victories, but the paratroopers hid, struck from behind with bazookas and explosives, and recaptured every position the Germans tried to take. The Germans craved order and timetables. The 101st brought chaos and violence, utterly unpredictable. Now, as the snow fell in Bastogne, the final showdown approached. Hitler's massive offensive depended on capturing the hub of Bastogne quickly. Every road, every intersection was vital. Eisenhower knew the stakes, and threw the 101st into the town before the Germans could seal the trap. Multiple German divisions surrounded them, pounding the town with artillery day and night. The snow and weather prevented Allied planes from dropping supplies. Foxholes became freezing tombs. Bullets were counted and rationed. The Germans expected quick surrender. They expected panic. But the 101st didn't break. Counterattacks were launched in the snow. Even isolated German tanks were destroyed in the close combat. Every man in the division felt like they had the enemy exactly where they wanted. McAuliffe's famous nuts wasn't bravado. It reflected the mindset of every soldier holding the line. They weren't trapped. They were in control. Bastogne became a symbol of American tenacity, defying expectations, breaking timetables, bleeding Hitler's last offensive dry. By the end of the war, the Screaming Eagle patch struck fear and hatred into German soldiers. They learned that light infantry, armed only with rifles and explosives, could humiliate even the most disciplined panzer divisions. The 101st didn't just win battles. They broke the German will. They proved that when men accept being surrounded, no enemy, no matter how strong, can intimidate them. Now the siege tightened, and what happened next would define the legacy of the 101st Airborne Division forever. The snow kept falling over Bastogne, muffling the sound of distant artillery, but doing nothing to soften its impact. Shells tore through buildings, shattered stone walls, and turned streets into frozen rubble. The men in their foxholes could not escape the cold. Their boots were soaked, their gloves stiff with ice, their breath visible in the air as they waited for the next assault. They were hungry. They were exhausted. But they were not afraid in the way the Germans expected them to be. From the German perspective, this battle should have been mathematics. Surround the town, cut off supplies, apply artillery pressure, launch coordinated infantry assaults supported by armor, force surrender. That was the doctrine. That was how encirclements worked. But this was not a normal infantry unit. These were paratroopers trained from day one to assume isolation, to expect confusion, to survive without a rear line. When other divisions worried about supply corridors, these men worried about fields of fire and overlapping kill zones. When others panicked at the idea of being cut off, they adjusted their perimeter and prepared counterattacks. German units pushed toward the defensive lines again and again. Tanks rolled through snowy clearings, expecting American infantry to scatter. Instead, bazooka teams waited in silence, hidden behind shattered walls and tree lines. They allowed armor to advance just far enough to separate from its supporting infantry. Then they struck. Explosions lit up the white landscape. Burning fuel stained the snow black. Close combat followed, brutal and personal. Rifles cracked at short range. Grenades were thrown over frozen embankments. The line bent at times, but it did not break. What made the defense so infuriating to German commanders was not just resistance, it was aggression. Every time the attackers seized a small section of ground, a counterattack came, often at night. Small groups of paratroopers moved through the darkness, navigating terrain by instinct and memory, hitting exposed flanks, reclaiming foxholes one by one. There was no dramatic sweeping maneuver, no grand armored breakthrough, just relentless, localized violence that shattered timetables. The offensive launched by Adolf Hitler depended on speed. Fuel reserves were limited. Roads were vital. Bastogne was the hub, and the longer it held, the more the entire operation stalled. Inside the perimeter, morale became a weapon. The now famous reply of "nuts" from General Anthony McAuliffe was repeated from foxhole to foxhole, half as a joke, half as a statement of identity. It meant something simple. We are not surrendering. That mindset filtered down to every private and sergeant on the line. They did not see themselves as victims of encirclement. They saw themselves as bait in a trap that the enemy had walked into. Every German assault meant more exposure, more casualties, more wasted time. Weather had grounded Allied aircraft for days. No resupply, no air cover. Wounded men waited in makeshift aid stations where morphine was rationed as carefully as ammunition. Yet when the skies finally cleared, transport planes appeared overhead, parachutes blossoming against the gray winter sky. Supplies drifted down into the frozen fields. It was not abundance, but it was enough. Enough to keep firing. Enough to keep resisting. German commanders began to understand that this was no minor obstacle. Each failed push cost fuel, vehicles, and irreplaceable manpower. Each day lost at Bastogne weakened the broader offensive. When elements of General Dwight D. Eisenhower's forces began maneuvering to relieve the town, the strategic picture shifted completely. The encirclement that was meant to crush an airborne division had instead fixed significant German strength in place. The timetable was broken beyond repair. When relief finally reached the perimeter, the men who walked out of their frozen positions were gaunt, sleep-deprived, and hardened beyond measure. They had endured artillery barrages, infantry waves, armored thrusts, and brutal cold. They had done it without the advantages the German army prided itself on: heavy armor, overwhelming artillery dominance, secure supply chains. They held because they refused to interpret their situation as defeat. By the end of the war, the Screaming Eagle insignia was instantly recognized by German soldiers. It symbolized unpredictability. It symbolized resistance in impossible conditions. More importantly, it symbolized a psychological shift. The 101st had demonstrated that encirclement did not automatically equal collapse. That lesson mattered far beyond Bastogne. It reshaped how airborne forces were perceived and how German commanders calculated risk. The Battle of the Bulge would ultimately fail for Germany, not only because of fuel shortages or Allied air power, but because critical nodes like Bastogne did not fall on schedule. And at the center of that delay stood a division that had already accepted isolation as routine. They did not just survive the siege. they transformed it into proof that willpower, discipline, and aggressive defense could paralyze a larger, mechanized force. The story of Bastogne is not simply about one word of defiance. It is about mindset. It is about training that prepared men to operate without certainty. And it is about how, in the frozen forests of Belgium, a surrounded airborne division helped bleed the last great German offensive dry. The story of the 101st Airborne Division did not end in the frozen forests around Bastogne. In many ways, that moment was only the beginning of their legend. Because what happened there sent a message that echoed across Europe. It reached German headquarters, it reached the soldiers on the front lines, and it reached the highest levels of command under Adolf Hitler himself. The message was simple and terrifying. These men could not be broken. For the German army, this was more than a tactical problem. It was psychological. For years they had relied on speed, shock, and overwhelming firepower. Their blitzkrieg doctrine was built on the belief that fear and pressure would collapse enemy resistance. But in Bastogne, they encountered something different. The American paratroopers did not collapse. They did not retreat. They did not surrender. Instead, they adapted, improvised, and fought harder the more pressure they faced. This completely disrupted German expectations. Every delay meant fuel shortages. Every failed assault meant lost tanks and experienced soldiers. Every day Bastogne held meant the entire Ardennes offensive was bleeding to death. And when the weather finally cleared and Allied aircraft filled the skies, it marked the turning point. Supplies began to fall. Air support returned. The German advance stalled, and soon it would begin to collapse entirely. When the encirclement was finally broken and American armored forces reached the town, the men of the 101st did not celebrate wildly. They were exhausted, freezing, and scarred. Many had lost friends. Many had survived only by inches. But they understood something important. They had not just defended a crossroads. They had stopped the last major offensive Germany would ever launch in the West. The reputation of the Screaming Eagles grew even stronger after the war. Veterans from the German Wehrmacht would later admit that airborne troops were among the most dangerous enemies they faced, not because they had superior equipment, not because they had overwhelming numbers, but because they fought with a mindset that ignored fear. They expected to be isolated. They expected to be surrounded. And because of that, they were almost impossible to intimidate. This mindset became a model for modern special operations forces around the world. The idea that small, highly trained units could disrupt much larger forces reshaped military thinking in the decades that followed. From Korea to Vietnam and into modern conflicts, the psychological lessons of airborne warfare remained relevant. At Bastogne, leadership also played a crucial role. Officers like Anthony McAuliffe understood that morale was as important as ammunition. His famous one-word response was not just a clever insult. It unified the entire division. It created a symbol of resistance that every soldier could rally around. Even today, that moment is studied in military academies as an example of psychological warfare and leadership under pressure. But perhaps the most powerful lesson of the 101st Airborne is not about war at all. It is about human resilience, the ability to endure when conditions are unbearable, the willingness to stand firm when logic says defeat is inevitable, the strength to keep fighting when surrounded, isolated, and outnumbered. History often focuses on tanks, planes, and generals. But battles are ultimately decided by individuals. Young men in freezing foxholes, soldiers who refuse to give up, people who make decisions in seconds that shape the fate of nations. Bastogne reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act despite it. And that is why the legacy of the 101st Airborne continues to inspire people far beyond the battlefield. Because their story is not just about World War II. It is about determination, leadership, and the power of mindset. It is about what happens when ordinary people refuse to accept defeat. So now I want to ask you, what moment in this story stood out to you the most? Was it the defiance at Bastogne? The chaos of Normandy? The brutal street fighting? Or the psychological impact they had on their enemies? Let me know in the comments below. I read as many as I can, and your thoughts help shape future videos. And if you want more deep dives into the brutal realities, hidden strategies, and untold stories of World War II, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week, we explore the moments that changed history and the people who made them happen.